the Cinematologists podcast, episode 139. Tyler Taormina, the director of Ham on Rye and the forthcoming Happer's Comet. In this episode, Neil talks to director Tyler Taormina about his latest film, Happer's Comet, which premiered at the 2022 Berlinale and is set for release later this year. The conversation covers Tyler's filmmaking process, his thoughts on cinema, his deeply indie approach to filmmaking, and some of the themes that he keeps returning to in his work. Elsewhere on the show, Neil and Dario tried to get to grips with some of those themes. In Dario's words, the crisis of belonging, as well as themes of alienation, and trying to figure out who we are and what we're doing as the pandemic stretches into its third year. Something that Tyler's film beautifully captures and engages with. On with the show.
Welcome to the Cinematologists podcast. I'm Dario Linares, and down the line, of course, is my good friend Neil Fox. Neil, how are you coping with the world at the moment?
Well, that's a big question. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to talk to you. That's helping the chaos and carnage of the world. Doing okay, hanging in there. It's even more stressful than it normally is at this time of the academic year, with lots of staff off with COVID and other illnesses, and our daughter at home also with COVID. So as if it wasn't stressful enough, but touch wood, doing okay. And it's nearly Easter. That's what I keep telling myself. It's nearly Easter. We're nearly there.
Yeah, we're nearly there. I'm a week away. I'm actually again on strike this week, so I'm observing that. You know, I have a lot of different conflicting opinions about the strike and how it's being organised, prosecuted, let's say. But I'm definitely in support of the four fights, as they're called. You know, the pay and the pensions, casualisation, and awareness of diversification and colonisation of the curriculum, that kind of stuff. But yeah, it has been very disruptive to, I think. It's really disruptive to the staff and the students, but it's also kind of like it's being used very tactically by the powers that be, the universities and the government, who actually I think want the fight. So this is just going to be ongoing and drawn out, and we've just been reballoted again for further strike action later on in the year. So I don't know how you feel, but I think universities are pretty much at a crossroads right now as to what they're for. I mean, we are going to go through a periodic review, which means we look at the course and what we're doing. And I know there's going to be some pretty significant changes, which is in light of, I think a lot of it is in light of the economic and cultural structuring of education more broadly, but very much what students are like these days. It's been, it's post-COVID. It's been a complete reset as to what a student comes to university expecting or can deliver themselves. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm a supporter of the four fights, but at Falmouth, we so far have not hit the threshold for strike action in terms of the amount of people who have responded to the balloting, which I think is telling in itself as well, in terms of the union members who probably don't feel that way, which is their right. And it's interesting here where I am, because we've got a new VC who is, kind of asking those very questions. What is a university for? What is Falmouth for? They seem very aware of the impact of the pandemic, and not in a real way. That they want to have that conversation about what do we do? How do we do it? What's the point of it? What can we do? What should we be doing? But
yeah.
my worry and my cynical side says that that there are too many other forces at play that don't want that conversation, because it's a philosophical conversation as much as it's anything else, and it has the power to radically change how universities are currently run. And for a lot of people who are not academics and not students, they're run fine because they provide jobs and they have processes that people engage with, whether they understand them or not, and they keep moving, even if what's actually moving them is just data that no one understands or needs. So I think it feels like a crunch point, and it feels like that the student response to the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on the students has led to this crunch point that can't really be avoided, because otherwise, I think disaster won't be averted. It feels similarly to the climate crisis, in the sense of, like, unless these conversations are had now, it's disaster awaits, I think.
I mean, I don't know whether a kind of like some big explosion will happen. Like, I don't know whether any universities will go under, but I'm pretty certain there will be a sort of slow decline, and people will leave, and then replacements will be found who will be working on lower grade contracts and all of this kind of stuff, and then universities will more and more fall into this pattern of there will be a huge discrepancy between sort of almost what America has, an Ivy League idea of what a university is, and then everything else is seen as substandard, which there's a little bit of that now, I think. But even in individual universities, you have courses that have great standing and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but whether they can be protected, because I think that a lot of those universities are not. A lot of people probably don't want some universities to remain. I think part of it is trying to get some of those newer, almost like a European Super League of, interesting times, and obviously, trying to think about that while just getting to the end of term is always difficult. But we're not here to talk about that completely. We're here to talk about movies.
Yeah.
So,
indeed.
So before we get into the main bit, is there anything you just wanted to mention that you'd seen that you thought was interesting to note?
Interestingly enough, I went to see the Batman because I had a couple of free tickets, and it was like a Sunday afternoon, and it's really funny. It is that period where there's not, if you've seen a lot, it's all done. There's a lot that I've seen online, and there was nothing specifically I wanted to see at the cinema, but it was like a Sunday afternoon. Should we go? And it was like, it was that window. It's a lovely time, is it? Sort of 3:00 on a Sunday afternoon, and it's a 3-hour movie. Oh, we'll get out, and then we'll be able to have dinner. It was just like, we'll do that. And like you say, I think sometimes I do feel bad that you don't see the films that the kids are all talking about. In this job, you've kind of got to do that. I mean, and in some ways, I'm more interested in going to see something like a regeneration of the Batman than I am of anything else in the superhero universe. So. Yeah, and I liked it a lot more than anything superhero-y that I've seen in a long while, I must say. I thought the production design element of it, the moodiness of it was really good. I like the fact that they kind of went back to the idea that Batman is sort of making his costume, and his car is just a souped up road car. It did look pretty souped up, let's say. But what was interesting, I mean, there's lots of interesting elements of it in the sense that it wasn't an origin story, which is interesting to me, because I've listened to quite a few podcasts that talked about it being an origin story, and I don't think it is. He's fully formed as the Batman, as in he turns up to crime scenes, straight away. There's no sort of going back to that the tired old, his parents were shot and therefore he's the Batman, and that kind of thing, which I thought worked. It was like, okay, we're in there. And it essentially starts off as a police procedural, which I was like really there for. You know what I mean? I was kind of like, this is really interesting. I mean, you do have to do that thing which you have to do with all superhero movies, but especially ones that want to remain within a kind of realist, not a realist universe, but a realist acceptance of what's going on in the script. So you have to sort of dismiss the fact that, a guy dressed as a big bat would not be allowed to wander around a police crime scene, in the real world. And one of the police officers says, really, Captain, you're going to let him walk around here? And that's it. He says, yeah, this is on me. He's going to investigate, right? It's really well cast, I thought. Completely, I think Jeffrey Wright is great. Colin Farrell, under all his makeup, is great. Paul Dano does Paul Dano, being kind of weird and psychotic, and Zoe Kravitz is very good as well. I have to say I didn't think there was any chemistry at all between Zoe Kravitz and Robert Pattinson as a pair. And then Pattinson himself is fine, but he isn't given a lot to do because, interestingly, again, another interesting point of the movie, he's in the costume a lot more than in other Batman movies. In most of the other Batman movies, Bruce Wayne is probably given equal screen time to Batman, whereas here it's mostly Batman and a little bit of Bruce Wayne. So he's kind of under the suit and he's trying to effect being Batman in that sense. So it is too long, and the two elements of the script don't sit together particularly brilliantly for me. So this whole police procedural element of it, and there's a whole kind of gangland, mobster setup, and how that plays out, then ties in incongruously to Paul Dano's Riddler, who's this, the crazy kind of character who's going to blow up the city type of stuff. And it is sat together, but it's really, and there's a real middle section of long exposition, which I had to really force myself to kind of work through, you know what I mean? I almost sort of fell asleep. But then, and the end, and it does have like 7 endings. It doesn't know where it wants to end. But I think it really has a lot of echoes of 7, and I went back and watched 7, and it reminded me how good 7 is. 7 is just tight, man. It really is a great movie. But I mean, again, just before we came on, I don't want to go on too long about this, but one of the interesting things is I went on to listen to a few podcasts because I wanted to hear what people who watch these kinds of movies a lot were saying, and I was just absolutely dumbfounded and kind of disappointed by the level of critical depth that it seems to be just the normal kind of takes that people have on podcasts about these movies. Now, maybe I'm not listening to the right podcast, but it just tended to be a variation of either, wasn't Robert Pattinson good? Wasn't Zoe Kravitz good? But no sort of depth as to why. No real explanation of the script. So the movie as a movie. And that's one of the things why I liked about it. That I thought it was, to the extent that these movies can be, self-enclosed enough that I didn't need to be a comic book fan or a fan of other movies. But on these podcasts, that's what they talked about. Oh, it reminded me of the Keaton movie here, or the Tim Burton version here. It reminded me of Nolan here. It reminded me of other superhero Easter egg moments here, and then reminded me of comics here. And it just made me think that this is the level of critical faculty. It's I'm going in and I'm searching for things that I recognize from other places, and therefore if it delivers those to me, it's good. And that is a real problem, I think, in the areas that I've listened to reflections on this film.
Yeah, I imagine I don't think it's just that film. I think we'll probably talk about this in the bonus if we talk about the Oscars. I don't know that people know how to watch things.
Yeah.
And I also think that part of it is, if you start to say things that are analytical, I won't even say critical, because but analytical, then you are a critic. You're not a fan. So, and we know that critics are bad, and the critics don't love movies. So I don't want to be someone who doesn't love movies. So I'm just going to say, the good things. And if the things are bad, it's because they're not doing that thing that you're saying. They're not referencing other things, or they're not referring to the canonical comic. So they're not. Then it's how they are in relation to things that already exist in that same world, and that, I think, that is a problem. It's certainly a problem for just the general cultural life of cinema. Interestingly, I haven't seen much recently. even sort of music docs has just been a really, really mad time. But I did watch Woodlands, Dark and Days Bewitched, which is
All right.
Kiela Janice's 3-hour documentary on folk horror.
Wow.
Yeah. So Kiela Janice is a scholar and has written sort of a lot about horror and folk horror. And this is a documentary that she's made. And you know, a bit biased because she found Backwards, which was a short that I wrote and produced, which was a H.P. Lovecraft adaptation. She found that when it played festivals and asked to see it, and then she included a clip of it in this film.
Nice.
Yeah, which is kind of amazing, particularly when you look at what's in there, you know, like Midsommar and Wicker Man and stuff. So she sent us a copy of the film, and we watched it in the cinema at work. And it's an absolutely brilliant piece of criticism. You know, it's obviously at its length, but it's aware. It's trying to find themes. It's trying to find a history. It's looking beyond the narrow scope of, you know, the canon. You know, the Holy Trinity, like Wicker Man and things like that. And it's really trying to say, is this a thing? You know, and what is this thing that is what is folk horror? And amazing clips, amazing research, you know, really in depth. And it was just really exciting and invigorating to see this, you know, this piece of work that took, you know, that was a film, you know, that was a film on itself. Great interviews, great clips, yeah, kind of, and took it in these really interesting places, like, well, you know, this has elements of folk horror. And like, so a film that she mentioned was which I know you saw recently, was The Reflecting Skin, the Philip Ridley film, you know, and just showed the clip from the beginning with the kid and the cornfield and the doll, you know, and just like, again, placing these things in context with other things and creating a conversation and putting forward an opinion that's critical, that can be challenged, you know, rather than saying Robert Pattinson is good, you know. And I think those two things are connected, you know. And so yeah, that documentary, I think it's on Shudder, it's also on Blu-ray. It's fantastic, and it really captures, you know, both the historic elements of folk horror, but also the recent resurgence and why it might be back. It's a very politically aimed and themed. You know, why are we doing this now? It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the Reflecting Skin, by the time this has gone out, Reflecting Skin will have left Mubi, but it was on Mubi. And Philip Ridley is a really interesting filmmaker that I knew about, but I hadn't really seen anything of. And yeah, it reminded me of early Malick as much as anything else. It was like Badlands, Days of Heaven stuff. Again, sure. at the risk of reminding me of what something else is like, you know what I mean, which I've just slagged off before.
But it's in dialogue with, or in conversation with, or it's in a lineage with. It's not just saying, oh, hey, look at this cornfield.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, what's interesting is I think that I was reading a bit about Ridley, and he's made this trilogy of horror movies. And again, you know, I'm not the world's #1 horror fan, but maybe he's still around, so maybe we could try and get a hold of him, because I'd like to see The Passion of Darkly Noon and Heartless, which I haven't seen. Yeah. Because Reflecting Skin is just really, really interesting take on the sort of vampire genre, let's say.
Yeah. Well, Passion of Darkly Noon, that's Brendan Fraser, wasn't it? So it's a good time to maybe look back at that. That was an interesting film for him to make at that time as well.
Sure.
So yeah, I'll be well up for that. That sounds
cool.
Great.
Cool. So this is an episode that you've put together with a film and a filmmaker that you've gotten in touch with, and I have to say it's really sort of it twanged a nerve with me, particularly in the last couple of weeks, the effect of watching this movie, which I thought was great. So why don't you bring us into that?
Yeah, will do. So yeah, this is an episode where I've interviewed Tyler Taormina, who is an American independent filmmaker. And yeah, weirdly, I reached out to his agent because he shares an agent with Amy Seimetz, who I love.
Ah, great.
And I reached out and I tried to get Amy Seimetz to do a masterclass for my students. And her agent said she's filming currently, but Tyler might be interested. And I knew, because I'd seen Tyler's first film, which was Ham on Rye, which I think is a really great, it as well. Yeah, great coming of age movie, and a really strange film. Weird, yeah, but like the good weird, you know, not like weird for the sake of it, just genuinely unsettling and weird. So I was like, yeah, that sounds great. So Tyler did an interview or did a masterclass for me, and we talked a lot about Ham on Rye, and just really got on well. I really liked talking to him. And just before that, I'd seen that his new film, Happer's Comet, had played Berlin and was sort of going into festivals. So I sort of cheekily said, I'd love to talk to you about that. I'd love to see that. Yeah, and he sent a link, and yeah, we talked about that, and we talked about filmmaking, and I think he's a really interesting filmmaker in terms of how he's approaching independent film and his career, and also that what I liked about both the conversations I've had with him, including this one, is that he thinks about his work, and he thinks about life, and he thinks about theme and how it all fits together. And yeah, just kind of refreshing again to what we were talking about. This is someone who's critically engaged with the process and the art of filmmaking in a really fascinating way, I thought. So yeah, he came on the pod, and we had a really great conversation. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you, Dario, about your thoughts on that and the film after we've heard it.
Great. So let's get into that now.
Thanks for joining me today, Tyler.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be talking.
So we're mainly going to be talking about your new film, Happer's Comet, which is kind of emerging into the world. It played at Berlin, and yeah, you shared it with me, which was really kind. I'm really excited to talk about it. It's a strange film, and I mean that as a compliment. I just wonder if you could just talk about how you conceived it and how you kind of put it together, because I don't imagine there was a traditional script or even sort of production process.
Yeah, the story behind this film is very much born out of the conditions of the 2020 lockdown period, where I was writing quite a bit with my writing partners on Zoom, and it's just a terrible experience to write on Zoom, to write during the pandemic, such an uncertain time. So I just was not creatively fulfilled, and I was obviously very mired by the world conditions, as anyone else was. But then I've had these images in my head for a number of years. I have a strange, what's the word I'm looking for? A strange affinity towards the act of sneaking out of one's household. Don't know why, but I'm very drawn to it. And I've had this image in my head for quite some time of people doing so on rollerblades, and rollerblading through the landscape, like a group of people, almost like a community of people doing so secretly. So I guess a subculture, and I've just always been attracted to seeing these dark landscapes lit sparsely by practical lighting sources, and people floating through them like ghosts on these rollerblades. I think it's funny and haunting, but also it also speaks to an absurdity that is inconceivable in general, but especially in the sort of suffocating normality of my hometown. So with these images, I went home to New York, Long Island, where I grew up, and I wanted to erect a project just based on loose images like this. And I did so with a crew of 2 people and an outline that covered a lot of vignettes and a general arc that they would sort of consummate all these vignettes in one location, which originally was a movie theater.
Okay.
Yeah.
How sort of conscious were you at the start of the overall feel of the film, or was that something that you found along the way? Because it feels very coherent, even though, like you say, there's a lot of different people and a lot of different sequences.
Yeah, the subconscious is a funny thing. I thought I definitely felt the vibe instantly. I knew what it was. I knew how it felt. That was the guiding light. I remember communicating that to my DP, Jesse Sperling, who was basically the other half of this film. I mean, literally the other half of the crew. It was a little difficult, but eventually we got on the same wavelength after some test shoots. But I really had this vibe of what the film would be, and I guess at a deep level, I knew exactly always what it was going to be. But at a more conscious level, I wasn't totally sure, because I was under the impression it was going to be a very dry comedy. I was like, oh, it's going to be so funny. All these things are too funny. We need to dial them down. And I had a different title for the film even. It was called The Holy Dance, which I think is an amazing title for a movie. And I think it's a great title for a comedy that doesn't have dancing in it. And when I watched it, I said, oh, this is absolutely not The Holy Dance. This is not funny even. This is very sad. So there's this discordance between how I felt the film was going to be and how I directed. I knew what I was doing in a sense, but I also didn't realize the tone in a sense as well. I can't really explain it.
That's interesting. The tone certainly seems to come out of the moment that it's made. It feels like it really taps into the feeling of the last couple of years, even though it's not about COVID in any direct sense. Obviously it was made during this time, and watching it, and I've seen it twice now, it's like this. It feels like a filmmaker who's kind of seeing this as an opportunity, like not just to tell a very direct story, but a chance to do something which has some real limitations, but kind of working within those limitations. So how much of it was a case of just thinking, okay, I'm going to go and do this, or we're going to do this, like the two of us, and I'm going to sort of push the parameters of what's possible on a practical level as far as they can go.
Well, we really were up against extreme limitations. This is not like we can conceive of the COVID period as now too. But if you really remember what the lockdown phase was like, it was very, very different than today, thank God. And it was extremely difficult to make this movie. I mean, where I'm from in Long Island, people generally don't take COVID very seriously. And even still, it was very hard to make the movie then, during that time. It was a movie born out of who is around, whose house can we go in, who's going to let us in their house, which businesses are going to let us go in there, and who's going to cancel day of. Happened many times. I've never dealt with so many actors canceling day of and having to get another actor that same day. So it's the type of movie where there's no production design. It's whatever we can get, even if it's not great. Whoever we can get, even if they're not the best actor, and we have to find out how we're going to honor them. So the whole thing is born by these very, very narrow confines, which kind of push it into the documentary space, in my opinion, because these are people playing themselves in their own houses at a time when alienation was at a height. But I have to say, I probably would have made the movie like this without COVID as well. Because I feel these themes of alienation very deeply.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to that, if it's okay, because I think there's such a unique energy in the film because of the locations and the cast. It's interesting you sort of say that about the documentary feel, because of those things. It reminded me, and you mentioned this filmmaker the last time we spoke, which was Simon Liang's Rizzi, or Days, which is a film I absolutely love. He's a filmmaker I love. And also kind of a Peach Pong where Ethical's work. Are they kind of acknowledged influences? What were the kind of films that you sort of saw this in the same universe as, in terms of the kind of experience that you would hope an audience would have with it?
For sure. They are such acknowledged influences. I get a little embarrassed with this film about the influences, because I think they're very prevalent, more so than other projects I've worked on, for better or for worse. I think Simon Liang, I've always enjoyed how his films are about the separation of people and the isolation and reconciling the disconnect that we have with our world around us. So that's very clearly a guiding force in this film, aside from the aesthetic parallels one can make between his films and this one. But I think one of the filmmakers I do like to acknowledge as a patron saint in this movie is a little less embarrassing for me, is Aki Kaurismäki.
Okay, lovely.
That was a big... Maybe I was a little more in comedy mode when I was... or mindset when I was thinking of him, but the way that he uses light and artifice and pace and his subjects even, he's a huge influence.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I think certainly in terms of, like you say, because you mentioned like the production design, but it's such a beautifully shot film. Thank
you very much.
Like at every turn, you can feel I think you feel the situation because you know when it was made, but you certainly don't see it on screen. You certainly see this very deliberate, very measured construction of place. So that's really interesting because he is definitely a filmmaker who sort of creates a mood. And that was one of the things I wanted to mention on, which is that you've got these, they're fictional places, even though they're real locations, and they're kind of characters, even though they're real people. A lot of your family, particularly, are kind of, And I find it such a special energy in the film because of that. What were the kind of the conversations that you had with your DP and your actors about, what you were trying to do? Because they're not really doing a lot. They're not really acting per se. You're just sort of capturing these moments of time with people, How did you kind of get them on board with both how the film was going to look and the pace and what they were being asked to do?
Yeah, it's really funny with the actors. There's such a gap between their understanding of the film and mine. We were actually shooting this film throughout the time where Hamon Rai was coming out in theaters in the U.S. and thus getting its first sort of official press releases, write-ups and reviews, which was a very, very overwhelming time for me. I mean, luckily it was a very positive experience, but emotionally it was just incredibly difficult. But and I was also turning 30 at the time of the shoot too, during the pandemic breakup and everything. It was a very intense time. But one of the good parts about Hamon Rai coming out is all those write-ups. People were really excited, so they would just be in the film no matter what. A lot of my family and friends, oh yeah, great, let's do it. Otherwise, I think they would have done it maybe, but there might have been a little less loyalty, a little less, from some of the more peripheral people in my community, not my. Yeah. But anyway, so they were just down to be in it. It's funny how little they understood of what the project was. Like, for example, my 91-year-old cancerous great aunt just got over COVID, no issue. She's in the film. She's very strong. She's the old woman who is alone in her home, which is her home. And we get there, and she's like, "Oh, I'm going to be in the film." And I was like, I literally told you this. And what do I got to do? So we shoot her, taking her phone call or whatever the scene is. And then, okay, we're going to do it from another angle. She's like, but I just did it. Like, why do I have to do it again? Like, she didn't even understand the process of filmmaking. In fact, she took a 5-minute phone call talking about horses as we were rolling her. And then I told her, and then we shoot the whole thing, and then I said, "Oh, thanks for being in it. It's a really kind of a heavy and sad scene," and she was just like, "What was so sad about it? This is just me on the phone and taking a nap in my kitchen." Like, she just did not understand what this film was in any way. And then my mom is in the film, and she's in the scene, which is a spoiler, so plug your ears if you don't like spoilers. But she's in the scene where we consider it the cornfield orgy scene. She has no idea that that's the scene she's in. She comes to the cornfield. She looks through the cornfield stalks. She goes home. She doesn't know the context, and I'm really curious how she's going to react to it when she gets to that. So in other words, I wasn't trying to tell my actors like this is a film about alienation, this is a film about the sadness. I wasn't trying to make any statements like that at all to them. It was just simply like, what are we gonna do? You're gonna push that car. You're pushing the car. Then they come, they push the car. I had a great time, and then they leave. So this sort of alienating them from the piece is also how I worked with Ham on Rye, where the cast was not allowed to read the script past their own pages. I think that if you're making a film about alienation, alienating your talent from the project is a great tool.
Yeah.
As far as Jesse and I, we mainly had, which was the DP, Jesse Sperling. We mainly had a sort of a movie reference based and painters and photographers. We were referencing art a lot to understand the lighting. Like I learned so much about lighting because I was gaffing and gripping. I would tell him this is how it's going to feel, and he would say, "Okay, you set that light up, you set that up." So I don't know. A lot of our conversations were about how our hard light sources would interact with the space, and I don't know. It wasn't a very cerebral thing, I guess, after the reference points were established between us.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting, I think, because it was such a close quarters production, which I guess Ham on Rye was as well. You're making these, very intimate, independent films at the moment. Right. And Jesse's directing some of this. I wanted to just because I wanted to ask you about your sort of company. You sort of mentioned sort of writing partners on Zoom. You seem to have a very sort of collective approach to things, sort of you feel like you're part of sort of building your own community of filmmakers, making really interesting independent work.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I definitely am part of a larger group of people who, without them, I wouldn't be talking to you right now for sure. Jesse is a part of that crew. In fact, he shot my first short film called Wildflies, which is you can watch it on Vimeo. It was never released publicly because I don't have the licensing to the music, but it's there for you to watch. But anyway, so some of the people in this crew are Carson Lund, who is the DP of Ham on Rye, and I'm actually producing his first feature called Ephus, which is a baseball movie in October. And we also work with John Davies. He shot and I produced his first feature film, Topology of Sirens, which is just such a beautiful movie. It was a little bit shafted by the timing of COVID, whereas Ham on Rye benefited the timing of COVID because we had the festival window just before COVID. He had the festival window during it. It was his film, so it really was a detriment to the film's run at this point. But it's playing at Sarasota next month. And that film is amazing. It's pretty masterful, to be honest with you. So I'm very excited about all the work we're doing, and I really do think that we see ourselves as trying to occupy a space in independent cinema that has not been occupied in a long time, which is a kind of straying away from the naturalism of the mumblecore and post-mumblecore and art house realism movements, which I'm a fan of, but my true heart is in 30s and 40s Hollywood and 50s and
that's really interesting. I think there's definitely a Circean feel to Happer's Comet.
That's amazing. Thank you. Wow.
But also, the weird kind of European and East Asian, and probably Middle Eastern as well in terms of Kiarostami. There's the work is not necessarily, although it's weird because it feels very American, but it's not. There's there's a different sensibility at play, and I think it's really exciting to hear that because I think so much of independent film in the UK and in the States is geared towards a stepping stone of the big thing, and not that you guys don't want that, but that you found such value and meaning and interesting work in that truly independent space, which is just really exciting, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, so I forgot to mention that our collective is called Omnes Films. It's just the company that we made for these films, which includes a lot more people than the ones I mentioned. but I think one of the through lines between our work is that we are really obsessed with the American landscape and how it's played on our psyche and whatnot. But we are obsessed. That's like the content of the film. But the form is very minded and yes, European 60s and 70s art house films and East Asian slow cinema and things like this.
Yeah, I think then I made the same note when I watched Ham on Rye and this, which was Haunted Americana, I called it, which sort of film, so you talk a lot about the kind of the themes of alienation that sit in both, and you sort of mentioned about kind of having an interest in it, like was this the theme of what you were working on when COVID hit, or did you start working on Happer's Comet and then realize, oh, I'm dealing in the same things again?
Actually, I was writing something that I'm just now potentially finishing at the beginning of the lockdown, which is totally different. It's not even an American landscape film, but I'm interested in making a film that is incredibly warm and inviting with no sort of ironic edge to it, no subversive edge to it. But yes, well, also with Happer's Comet, the way that I conceived of it was this kind of suburban subversion thing that I thought was very funny. But when I went back to my hometown, I think there's a lot of sadness there that was sort of inescapable. I mean, that's my relationship with it anyway. I mean, I love where I grew up. I love the people there. I'm not trying to knock it. But there is, I mean, just like anyone leaving the place of their youth and returning, there is always going to be a sadness involved. So I think that was going to creep up into it either way.
And it's hard to, it's hard to not make a film that's sad under the conditions that you're shooting in. You're having to shoot people on their own because of, and that just that true. Spending time with people on their own is, and knowing that they've been on their own, and then you're saying, it feels very lonely, and
it's
I think
so funny. It's sorry, continue. I have a joke thing that I'm gonna say.
Okay. It feels lonely because that's what we've become used to in the last couple of years is that isolation, but then you realize that because of where these people are in terms of their work or their home, that this extends back. It's not we feel that this has been the direction of travel for so many people for so many years, and COVID just really kind of exacerbated that.
I agree. I think it's an exacerbator of our condition already, for sure. That's why these images have already been with me before COVID hit. But another thing I wanted to say was that one time I was talking to a few friends, and we were imagining looking into a stranger's window, and we were trying to think of the activity that they would do that would be the least sad as a voyeur to look upon. And basically what we decided in that night is almost anything they do is sad. They're watching TV. They're doing the dishes. If you're looking at someone in their home, just them, there's just going to be I don't know, maybe at night especially.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that says about us or about if anyone else agrees, if they feel that way as well.
No, that's interesting, yeah, because obviously, with that, it's not really a spoiler, but it's a nighttime movie, which does double the sadness, because I think there's a sense of like, this is our leisure time. This is the time that we get to explore and do stuff, and it's like, what is there to do? What are we doing? Yeah, I've never thought.
But also think about it, if you're awake in the middle of the night and you're not working, you're automatically set against the grain. There's either you have an issue of insomnia, or you're just a total outlier and you don't have the same sleeping schedule as other people. So there is a natural transgression built into being awake in the middle of the night if you're not working.
Yeah. And I think as well the nighttime thing gave it such an eerie stillness. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sound design, which is just fantastic, but also kind of, again, just heightens this sense of loneliness and even though these people sort of brush up against each other sort of geographically, there's no, until the end, there's no real connection, there's no real sense of community, even though they are technically a community, and the sound design really heightens that sense.
Yeah, the sound design. So we did not have sound on set recorded. Not one bit of audio was recorded on set. It was entirely done within 1 month of post production. I was also sound designing and editing the assembly cut, so I was just building it. I couldn't really I couldn't really edit the scene without the sound. Like you can't gauge a scene without the sound design for a film like this.
Yeah.
It's as much as part of the image as the image. So I was building it mainly through like YouTube sound effects, mainly through like I rarely Foleyed. I obviously had to Foley some roller skating sounds, some leaves, things like that. But mostly I was trying to find the most cartoonish sounds possible to put this in a sort of unnatural, impressionistic space. And I think the sounds are, as you mentioned, a unifier of these disparate episodes depicted in this film, because a lot of these sounds are some of the only communal fabric. I mean, if you look at this film, the only things that really stitch together these isolated points on this grid are sounds of bugs and dogs and cars that pass by and the music that plays in them, just things that are kind of floating around space. And the train, of course, the sound of this train that seems to circle and circumnavigate without discretion this neighborhood. And of course, finally, the police. The police are a unifying factor as well in their presence in the film. So I think that the sound was very important for me to be able to stitch together two separate vistas, two separate frames. It was the only unifying factor between these disparate frames. It was the sound.
When we talked before, I brought up Lynch, who's the kind of the figure of Haunted Americana. And I know you sort of said before it wasn't necessarily specific or sort of foregrounded influence, and then the start of Happer's Comet, there's this image, and I'm like, wow, that's Blue Velvet sort of all over with the sound, and then hearing you talk about the sound and the way that the sound is the beating heart of the work in terms of allowing us to stitch, like you say, stitch all this stuff together. Are you willing to admit that you're the natural heir to Lynch?
I actually returned to that movie Wildflies not that long ago for some work-related reason, and I realized, holy shit, the Lynch influence here is so annoying. It's so obvious, but it's only peppered in. And in Ham on Rye, it's pretty foundational, and it's actually very direct. I mean, we were literally shooting pickups for that movie for like a year or two. And those pickups coincided with Twin Peaks: The Return. So we would watch them, and then we would shoot, and some of them are some of these scenes, maybe one in particular, are so indebted to that show that, yes, it's undeniable. This movie, I was not thinking about him at all. I guess it's subconscious at this point. And I know that the next two movies I have, out of three on the docket, two of them are just so not Lynch that no one will be able to even say that at all, and they'll see the other parts of me. But one of them, you're going to hear that again.
Challenge accepted.
Very funny.
I just wanted to touch back on the police presence, because it's really unsettling. And I watched it the first time and it was unsettling, and then I watched it again last night and I was like, why is this so unsettling? And I think it's because we don't, well, it might be a bit of a spoiler, we don't see them, they're not, we don't know who they are, but it's almost like it's the symbolic presence, the power is in the symbol rather than the human beings who might be Well, there's a shot, the last shot, I don't know if this is communicated to everybody,
And again, if you don't like spoilers, don't listen. But there's the last shot is of a boat in the river, and it says Bay Constable. That's a police boat in this river. I grew up on that river. I actually didn't even realize there was a police boat circling there because I grew up across the street from the river, and I don't have direct access to it. But that is pure symbol. There is no crime in that river. There's no crime in my hometown, really, except for opioid use and speeding, going 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, if that's considered a crime. So it is purely symbolic. The fetishism, actually, of the police in my hometown community. This is a Blue Lives Matter place that I grew up in. Well, I mean, it wasn't when I grew up, now it is. So it is very loaded, and a part of the police thing is it's obviously very open for interpretation, but I see it as these people are afforded their isolation due to this sort of this presence.
Yeah, and for me, there's a kind of chicken and egg thing with that and the technology, that sort of runs through the film in terms of, are these people lonely because they're just on their phone all the time, or are they, on their phone all the time because they're lonely? And similarly with this idea, like, what's the police's role at this in a time like this when but making sure people are staying in, and if they're out, it's because they're not aware of what's going on. Is that a crime, or is that something? Is that something else? And what happens when the police become involved in patrolling this space, and what does it make people feel like when they're just going out for a rollerblade? I think it just raises so many questions that are really pertinent to where we are now. But it's such an interesting way that it's not kind of hammered home.
I want to say that maybe this is not obvious for people in their experience, but in my hometown, if you're in a neighborhood at night, like if you were walking around a neighborhood at 2 a.m. and a police car passed by, it would be a thing. You'd be like, even if it doesn't matter what color your skin is. I mean, it probably matters if you're not white more, but even if you are white, you feel like an intruder. So if you were on rollerblades, you would feel all sorts of at odds with the world around you. But I wanted to also comment on one thing you said about the fact that you can't see them. One thing I didn't realize going into this film, but I realized it upon watching the cuts, was that the relationship with the gays is so interesting, because it seems to be in the presence of the police or the surveillance cameras or the people just kind of spying on one another, even through the cornfield. It seems to be almost a way in which one can gain power over another. It's like the very easy read on it. But at the same time, it also seems like the only way one can reach out to one another as well. So there's this interesting kind of duality in the gaze that I realized watching this movie, that it's a way that we sort of establish protection and for ourselves and dominance over others, but it's also a way that we connect with others, which is fucking insane.
Yeah.
So that kind of blew my mind watching this movie.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yes, so much of where we look is guided, and it's not always
that's a good point.
Malevolent. Like it's the way of things a lot of the time. I don't really want to talk too much about the cornfield because I think it's such a nice but it does kind of symbolize in a very sort of direct way to Ham on Rye, where this strangeness feels rooted in a lived and understood experience, goes somewhere else. It felt very much part of that, again, a haunted Americana. I think all the American sci-fi movies that have these cornfields where these strange beings emerge or are found, and that it's such a strange thing that it feels like the only place they can have connection is in this space, and it's a clandestine space, and it's a natural space, but it doesn't feel You know, it sort of feels manufactured and it feels managed in a way, which sort of makes it.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's man-made. Those lines are they're straight lines.
Yeah.
It's true. I never thought about that. They're not natural. Wow. Yeah. So I could speak a little bit about this cornfield space for sure. For one, shooting in there was very, very surreal. Shooting in the middle of a cornfield, which is very far from all roads, in the middle of the night with only a few people, and this large, towering light that is on like maybe a 15, 20-foot tripod, or not tripod, C-stand. I don't know. I'm forgetting now what these things are called. Powered by this generator that's kind of like humming in this field. It was so weird. I was actually tripping out at one point, thinking like, this is very odd. But what I like about the cornfield so much, and I found myself very drawn to it as a location for other films. I've been writing it quite a bit. Is that it reminds me of, and this is not a direct influence. I don't think this is playing with. But when I saw this movie, I realized, oh, this is kind of what I'm interested in. Is this post tenebras lux, where they're in this like, what is it, like a spa or like a workout room or a locker room where there's like fog everywhere and haze.
Yeah.
And they're doing all this sexual activity in there. I think that's how I remember it, and I think this is very important for me because it resonated with me so much to think of these spaces where we can have shared anonymity, and that's what I think that this cornfield offers you. It offers you privacy, but there's a grid of private enclaves where you can kind of be run tangent to another someone, and admittedly there's got to be shame. There's got to be shame involved if you're opting for this sort of secrecy.
Yeah.
So it's a shared shame space, I think. Now, it's not just a Children of the Corn scary space, which it is too.
Yeah. No, that feeds in, but I think that shame is such a powerful word in that context. 'Cause like you say, we've seen the lengths that they have to go to, you know, physical lengths. You know, we see them in their home spaces or around there, and they can't. There's no, you know, they've got the police patrolling, and even when they're on their own, in that there's a sense that we're watching or someone's watching, and because we can't really see in the cornfield, it becomes the only space, which is again telling in terms of how far people have to go to be themselves contemporarily, which is that's a very powerful statement right there. A couple more before we wrap up. One is about kind of in line with this, which is about the train. That then we spend time on the train, but it's a model train. Is that too much of a spoiler?
It's not a model train.
It feels so.
It's just like it's not the same. I'll just say this: it's not the same camera. It's not the same camera. It's not the same country. It's not the same world. It's grafted in and plays impressionistically for that reason. But the train is that's another one that I really have to figure out why I care so much about these trains. And in my film that I'm hopefully going to be producing this year, Christmas Eve, Miller's Point, the train is a very important facet of that film. Yeah.
We definitely feel it. I don't think it needs to be explained, but it's felt. And then there is a sequence where we're on the train, which felt very.
I just want to explain the context though of the train in this town because it might be very specific.
Okay.
That it might be important to say. But basically, the town that I grew up in is next to a place called Kings Park, which was a psychiatric center. It was literally just a psychiatric center, like a really creepy one, like really, really looks like a haunted a group of buildings. And basically the community was built around this psychiatric center to incentivize people to, I guess, work there or live there. Like basically that's like the starting point of this forested development. And then all these towns obviously bloomed around it and became... they were all developed to be basically commuter towns for New York City. So basically my hometown is it exists so that people could just get to New York City. There's no communal space in the town. There's no like parks people go to hang out at. That there's no place for gatherings. Basically, even the Hamilton Eye really depicts this. Even the parking lots. That's like the closest thing you're gonna get to like a space where there could be a shared opportunity. So this commuter train that kind of moves in and out of it is this. It has this loaded, strange presence to one, take you away from your home, and two, kind of. I don't want to say acknowledge that your town is like a subordinate town, but it sort of is like that.
Yeah.
So I think these are the reasons why I'm so drawn to the train.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, thanks for indulging that, because I was just like, it's such a strange thing. I just wanted to end with the kind of the nice note that you put at the start of the film. There's a great collection of Kiarostami's sort of interviews and sort of teachings, where he says like his dream is to have a film where there's one credit page and it lists everybody that worked on it, like no hierarchies, and like everyone made this film. And I've always loved that idea, and I did it for a short during lockdown, actually, a weird one. But then I saw at the start of the film, like, produced by my family, and I just really loved it. I love that the acknowledgement is up front, and it sort of sets you into the space of the film, because often families are thanked on the end, because there's often an unpaid contribution that the people around us put into making films, sort of seeing it up front was, again, just a nice reminder of this is someone who's kind of truly thinking about independent film and thinking that actually, this film is made in a certain way, and we're going to honor it. We're not going to pretend that it's made in a way that people think films are made, So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the experience of working with your family on a film that, is going to go out into the world in a way that, I think sorry to sort of, but like when people sort of talk about making films, it's often like before they make the breakthrough film, they talk about all these short films and other films where people sort of came in and, this is a film that played Berlin and is going to play other festivals, is going to get released, and your family's right up there as being sort of central to the making of it, so yeah, just wanted to sort of end thinking about that, really, in terms of making a film with your family that is not a short that's, this is, you've had a breakthrough film and you've made this very special, wonderful film with these people.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say that I, especially now that I'm really brushing up with like the Hollywood industry and apparatus, seeing any success with Happer's Comet, I've gotten my fair share of people who really made me feel like, oh wow, I've affirmed, right? I really do want to constantly come back to making small, no budget personal films, kind of like how Kiarostami said, just a film with the materials that you could fit in your trunk. That's which admittedly we needed the whole car for this one. two cars even. Yes, I there's such a beauty in doing this. I want to, even if I make these multi-million-dollar films, which I might make, I still want to continue making films like this. It's so important. It's so I see it sort of as an exercise, which kind of makes it strange to show to the world your exercises. But speaking of family, I moved back to my hometown for 4 months to make this film during lockdown, partially because my roommate in Los Angeles was going to move in with his girlfriend during lockdown. So I had to make a decision. Do I bring in another roommate who I don't know during this time when we're going to be forced to live with each other? Like, hell no. Do I live by myself during this time where I'm going through a breakup and I can't see anyone? Like, that sounds horrible. So it just fell into place for me to go back and live with my family, the 5 of us, my 2 siblings, my parents, and the dogs, for the first time since I was a teenager. So it was a very special chapter. And the fact that we could all get together, talk about Okay, what location can we use? Oh, that person's good. Oh yeah, you're gonna be in it. Cool. Oh, Dad, can you hold this hose and go over the car windshield every minute like a sprinkler would? My dad doing that. I sitting in there, it was very special. It was very special, and I say with such a great deal of pride that I was able to make a film with my family. People who do not have any care about art cinema in any way. Open-minded to them, to the context of me, should I say. But yeah, it's very special to bring in people who don't have any stake or interest or even compatibility with that world. To me, it's just very special.
Yeah. Oh, so it's so nice to hear, because it doesn't feel like an exercise. It feels like
cool.
It feels like I think it's a really wonderful piece of work, and yeah, it's another reminder that films can be made hundreds of different ways, and they could be special and meaningful and thought provoking, and challenging. It's a reminder that
you ever see Five for Ozu? I don't know if we're like short on time right now.
Yeah.
You ever see Five for Ozu?
No, I've not seen Five for Ozu.
This is a Kiarostami film that is so. Oh, did you ever see Seagull's Eggs?
Yeah.
Is that what it's called? Yeah, it's basically like 5 of those.
Okay, great.
Oh, it's just such a reminder that. And when you watch Five for Ozu, you leave the room after wherever you are, and you see more than you ever saw. You see, your eyes are open again. It's crazy.
Cool. Well, I felt similarly watching Happer's Comet.
That's just the biggest compliment I can get. Thank you.
I'm a big admirer of your work, and I hope you keep making all sorts of work as you go through.
Right on.
Thanks for talking to me today.
Appreciate it so much, Neil. Thank you.
My family moved out west, out to LA. You ain't made a lot of promises, that's all that they made. The highway's lonely.
Thank you, Tyler, for the conversation. Thanks to Adam Kersh as well for the introduction originally and sort of setting up the original chance to talk to Tyler. I really enjoy talking to him, and I hope that the listeners enjoyed that. But yeah, Dario, what did you make of the conversation? And you've seen Happer's Comet as well, so we can get to talk about that, which is exciting.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, but I really enjoyed it in that way that it's not kind of obvious and sort of, oh yeah, that was fun, or the script was good, or I sat down and really, when I realized what it was, I saw, I sort of kind of went, I need to be in a sort of physical and mental space here. So the lights went off. I got right in front of the TV. The volume went up just so I could, and I want to watch again with earphones on, having heard some of the things he said about the sound and that kind of thing, because I did realize it needed what I'm calling sort of a deep listening to a film. That really, really helps. But yeah, just a fascinating kind of abstract, weird collection of images and moods and tones that kind of come together in a way that was it accidental? Not accidental in the way that I mean haphazard, but I'm sure when you sit in the editing booth, he had a kind of clear picture of, and he says this in the interview, that this is going to go here, 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 and we're going to end up here. But then you're never going to really know what the effect of that is going to be for an audience, are you? Until it happens. It might be, oh well, this has just not worked, kind of thing. But it definitely does work in the terms that I think it sets out to achieve, as Tyler was sort of talking about. I mean, interesting, that question of when is a lockdown film not a lockdown film, and in some senses, this isn't a lockdown film in that it's not about lockdown, but it has a lockdown sensibility, you know. And I want to talk a little bit about Alienation sort of later on, perhaps, because all films really, you know, especially, you know, well, most films are subject to the conditions and resources that happen to be available to you. So in that sense, every film is, you know, defined by the environment. There's only, you know, huge films with big budgets that can create a production designed world from scratch. Most films are just being made with what's around you. So, you know, just because it's lockdown, it's still the conditions that are available at that time. But that sense of, you know, loneliness and discrepancy between the world that we observe and the world that is behind what we observe, or the narratives we create about the world that we see, is really interesting. And I thought that sense of the facade that everyone has a secret life that we don't really know is a really interesting thing for me anyway. And I think the idea that we never really know what's going on is something that's just captured beautifully here. And it's done in a kind of the aesthetic tone of the movie, the camera angles, the positions, the movements, the subtle zooms and pans here and there, the sound resonances. We get a glimpse into that parallel universe that exists, as I say, alongside the stories that we just tell ourselves about how the world is, right? Which I think is great. You know, something like The Twilight Zone does that on a really obvious way. Do you know what I mean? That's on the nose, whereas this isn't on the nose. This is enigmatic and abstract, right? And, you know, obviously the Lynch comparison is there, that kind of cognitive doorway to an America that's behind the curtains. And I think particularly the framing of characters in space and the weird, the making weird of the ordinary, like the guy just counting the money and the geezer just sort of hoovering with his earphones on, just become weird for a reason that it's very difficult to fathom. But it's all in the shooting and the sound, obviously. And you know, just before you come back in, I mean, interestingly, the influences of We're As Ethical, I could see. I mean, the Kaurismäki one, I thought, oh, right, that's kind of interesting. I can sort of see it on the weirdness level, but I think Kaurismäki is much more, you know, script orientated in his weirdness, you know. But I saw a lot of Kelly Reichardt in The Stillness, you know, and like with her, obviously there's more dialogue. But just sort of the stillness of environments, I thought was a bit sort of Kelly Reichardt. And, you know, at the end, it just sort of went into sort of early sci-fi again with the cornfields. You know, that cornfield aesthetic was very obvious. But yeah, what it does, all of that it does really well. And I just love how the coherence does sort of emerge towards the end of the movie. And it pays off if you give it the attention that is required, let's say, with a movie of this. So yeah, I really liked it. And I thought, his sensibility was really interesting as well, because he came across as quite down to earth as a filmmaker. You know, he understands what he's trying to do, but he's putting it in terms, I think, that are very, very sort of straightforward and accessible. And that's not a criticism. It just means that, wow, the level of depth in the work is. He's got a grasp of it he's definitely got a clear grasp of what he's doing, and he can articulate that. Yeah.
Cool. I'm so pleased that you got stuff, you got that from it, you know, really interesting to hear you talk about it. And yeah, I feel very similar. I love the Kelly Reichardt and the Twilight Zone, you know, kind of references. I think they are absolutely, sort of spot on, and kind of reminder of just what's at play, because he's not making it like any of those filmmakers, but obviously it's just like you say, able to just be in communion with those things in the way those filmmakers are with their own their own universe of influence. So yeah. And yeah, so you mentioned before, I'm curious to hear what, because you said about, what one of the things that really struck you was the sense of alienation and the question of a sort of modern contemporary alienation. So do you want to just sort of elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I was asking myself, you were talking in the interview about alienation, and like, it's a word that's sort of bandied around from what? And I was thinking, what are we alienated from? Again, alienation has lots of kind of connotations and denotations that are related to, say, academic disciplines, let's say, right? But I suppose it's kind of like that. In the last few years, we talk a lot about the alienation from our environment, and also the alienation from contexts of belonging, if that makes sense. Whether they're institutional contexts like the workplace. It's like now, like the workplace now suddenly has a sort of connotation of a place of social interaction, more than it did before the COVID pandemic, because it's kind of like that idea of, now why should we go back to work? We should go back to work because these spontaneous moments of interaction and communication occur, which you don't get on Zoom, which is true. But it's kind of like, it's trying to make a case of belonging for the workplace again, to make it relevant in an era where it's become irrelevant. So it's funny how I think we're living through a world where our attachments and our modes of communication have disrupted the ways that we belong to things. And therefore, alienation is a more complex category of responses, I think, than perhaps we talked about it before. And you can think about that sense of, we talked about in talking about the students, they come into the classroom and they don't talk to each other. They tweet on their phones, and they don't know, it seems a lot of them don't know how to communicate anymore. So are they alienate? It seems there is some sort of level of alienation from the very idea of being in concert with other people without this filtering system, right? And I think, that watching the film and the tone of alienation that it creates as an experience, I think, is that idea that we are all operating under just the perceptions of what other people's relationship to their spaces and times and places are. So therefore, it's kind of like we look at that, and what the film is giving us, is this is kind of weird. This is not what you think it is. So I'm now alienated from, an American small town experience, or, somebody working in a shop now is not somebody that I can kind of understand what their relationship to me is in any real or given way through this film, through this watching of this film, or what it means to have a family in an American small town. Because you were talking about that in the interview again, and it's not obvious that this is about his family, but clearly now thinking about why he's made the film, it's kind of like a sense of, what is who are my family? What is my relationship to them? And I just think it chimes with, and again, the reason I'm stuttering and hesitating is I'm trying to do that thing of thinking through it on the fly, which is very difficult. But it is that it captures that mood that we're all in that our notions of belonging are kind of being questioned in ways that we hadn't expected, I don't think, because we'd already figured out in our minds what that belonging was. Like, say, for example, the family. It seems incredible that during COVID, you have kids who are at home all the time, and parents are moaning about their kids being at home, right? And I haven't got children, so I don't feel like I have the right to say this. So you can come back on it. But it's like, and because I haven't got children, I've got a bit of distance. I'm like, really? How can you do that? And it's because like the whole process of the institution of the school and the family and the home, the trifecta of that had a very clear construction, but now it doesn't. So so does that mean then that suddenly my relationship from my kids is now different to what it was before? And this is what I mean by the idea of alienation is something that I think has been recomplicated. Let's say. I'm sorry if that was a massive ramble, but that's I'm trying to work it through.
Well, that's the joy of it, is listening to you try and work it through. No, I think there's a lot there, isn't there? Which is great. And I think it's where to start with that. I think the point you sort of made about kind of that we say alienation and it's almost a given, as if what does that mean, but it's actually more complicated, I think, is a really interesting one. I think, like a lot of things, and I think one of the thinking back on the film is that it's sort of presenting these things which are the normal life or the normal interior life of people, but in a way that because of the time we spend with them and because of the way that the sort of the camera, as the sort of the POV moves through the film, is sort of almost kind of taking an alienated stance, because it doesn't understand it and it doesn't want to spend the time, or doesn't have the time to engage with it, which I think is, and I think the police kind of moving around that space sort of accentuates that, because I feel that a lot of the time as well, is like, and it largely to do with sort of social media and sort of whatever the discourse is, but there's a sense of, if you don't feel alienated, whatever that means, then you're not really engaged. Like you're constantly being told how to be. So we're always told we're all alienated, and we're all sad our kids are at home rather than being at school. And it's like, well, what if I don't feel like that? And things move very quickly. So you end up another layer of quote unquote alienation, because it's like, well, you're telling me what that is. I don't know that you know what that is. And I don't know why I should, like, I don't know why I should feel that way about my job sometimes, or, like there's such a sense of how you should feel about things, be that the Oscars, or whatever, like this is how you must feel. And it's like, well, what if I don't feel like that? And then I move away from the screen that's telling me to feel like that, and suddenly the environment that I'm in feels different, because, I'm questioning it in a way that I wasn't before. And that feels, again, not a product of the pandemic, but certainly sort of exacerbated by it in a kind of a worrying way.
But the beauty of this movie is that in seeing that the aesthetic and the having that doorway in, as I said, that sort of parallel universe to the story that you tell yourself about a situation, is you're giving a different psychological entrance to it. I feel less alienated in watching it. You know what I mean? By watching it, because I've got a view on the process and the aesthetic of alienation. Whereas, like, say, for example, you can go and watch a big special effects movie and I'm completely alienated from it. In you know what I mean? No, and that's where alienation comes in. Or say, for example, I feel alienated from the institution of the university and the way that it organizes itself, and I have to get through that alienated feeling to the point of being in a room with students and trying to fight off their alienation from all of their experiences to force a situation where there is some kind of community or communication that we can where something is shared.
No, that's really interesting. And I like the way you put that, because it is a film that really rewards the experience of sitting with the idea of alienation and different ideas of alienation in a way that's not trying to tell you what it is or how to solve it, or even make a political point about what causes it fundamentally, but like this is a thing, and this is it's like you say, it invites you into the experience of engaging with your own sense of self with it, and also understanding others in really kind of fascinating ways that are very cinematic and very, I think, very emotive in terms of the way that the form is is sort of creating sort of feeling throughout. So yeah.
But also, it's a crisis of belonging, isn't it? Just to sort of round that off, it's like, everybody's searching for being belonging to some kind of circle of connection. But in today's culture, it's narrower and narrower. The idea of political identity, let's say, if you're black or gay, or any kind of identity that you want to associate yourself with. These are saying one thing means myriad other things to other people, and then there are other intersecting identities that you may belong to that might be to do with religion or nation, or what I mean. We're in many ways we're seeing a war playing out over the question of belonging. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and it's a really problematic kind of place that we found ourselves in now, where we're grasping for it, but it's melting away as we grasp, in a sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting to see the film in that light, and sort of think about the narrative element of these individuals doing something which they have a sort of private shame or kind of think they're the only people doing, and realizing through the film that outside in the world there are other individuals doing the same thing, feeling the same things, but they don't know about it because of the barriers that are between that knowing, and it is that kind of political identity thing of like, you can't think, you're not in my experience, so you couldn't possibly get it, and you wouldn't, you have no frame of reference. But it's actually like, in this film, a lot of people want to go rollerblading at night, but their paths don't cross, because they think it's them, and at that really base level, that's a really interesting to think about in terms of where we are, isn't it? Like you say, where, we could belong if we just thought about, or made a step or made a bridge, but there are so many things stopping that understanding of each other on a common ground because of the individual things that are not like the other person, that we can't find what's common. Yeah, well, it's just taken on another level of depth there, I think, just in that conversation.
I mean, and to be honest, it's going to lead into what we're going to talk about on the bonus, isn't it? Because it's kind of like we are going to talk about the Oscars, believe it or not, for the bonus, to break the habit of a lifetime. But I think, the event itself, we don't want to do sort of a take on the event and what it means very specifically. But I think there are interesting things about the reactions to that which feed into what we're talking about here, and that that sense that so many reactions online to what happened at the Oscars do smack of this sense of people trying to forge their position. You know what I mean? Which is this kind of grasp to, I want to belong to this opinion group, let's say, or this, and that opinion group correlates to these kinds of people in our minds. Do you know what I mean? So it's really fascinating that. So maybe we can, that's something we can kind of talk about in relation to that event, because I think there is weirdly there seems to be a correlation that comes out of that conversation.
Yeah, no, I think you found one with that. Yeah, really interesting exploration of the film and Tyler's interview. So yeah, I think we'll head over to the bonus now, if that works with you, Dario.
Yeah, let's do that. Just to say well done to the for the episode, and it was a great. Thanks very much to Tyler for doing it, and I look forward to seeing what comes next for him, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad you like the film, and hope all of our listeners get to see it. It should be at festivals near them over the course of the year and then released. So keep your eyes peeled. And if you haven't seen Ham on Rye, then definitely go back. That's available to rent in various places. So yeah, thanks to Tyler, and thanks to our listeners. We will see you at some point in the very near future with another episode. But for now, this has been the Cinematologist podcast. Thanks for listening.